a letter for George, and was trying to do her homework in a corner of the common room when her cousin George came bursting in. George wasn't a boy, she was a girl called Georgina, but because she'd always wanted to be a boy, she insisted on being called George. So George she was. She wore her curly hair cut short, and her bright blue eyes gleamed angrily now as she came towards Anne. Anne, I've just had a letter from home, and guess what? Dad wants to go and live on my island to do some special work, and he wants to build a sort of tower or something in the castle yard. The other girls looked up in amusement and Anne held out her hand for the letter that George was waving at her. Everyone at their boarding school knew about the little island off Kirin Bay that belonged to George. Kirrin Island was a tiny place with an old ruined castle in the middle of it, the home of rabbits and gulls and jackdaws. It had underground dungeons in which George and her cousins had one or two amazing adventures. It had once belonged to George's mother, and she'd given it to George, and George was very fierce where her precious Kirrin Island was concerned. It was hers. Nobody else could live there, or even land there without her permission. His, and now here was her father, proposing to go to her island, and even build some sort of workshop there. George was red with exasperation. It's typical of the grown-ups, they give you things, and then act as if the things were theirs all the time. I don't want Dad living on my island and building nasty messy sheds and things there. And yes, oh George, your dad's a famous scientist who needs to work in peace, said Anne, taking the letter. Surely you can lend him your island for a bit, Hythe. There are lots of other places where he can work in peace, said George. I was hoping we could go and stay there in the Easter holidays, take our boat there, and food and everything, just like we've done before. Now didn't bore my we won't be able to if Dad really does go there. And read the letter. It was from George's mother. In my dear George, I think I should tell you at once that your dad is planning to live on Kirrin Island for a little while in order to finish some very important experiments. He'll have to have some kind of building erected there, a sort of tower, I believe. Apparently he needs a place where he can have absolute peace and isolation, and also, for some reason, where there's water all around him. The fact of being surrounded by water is necessary to his experiment. Please don't be upset about this. I know that you feel Kirrin Island is your very own, but you must allow your family to share it, especially when it's for something as important as your dad's scientific work. Dad thinks he'll be very pleased, indeed, to lend him Kirrin Island, but I know your funny feelings about it, so I thought I'd better write and tell you before you arrive home and see him installed there, complete with his tower. The letter then went on about other things, but Anne didn't bother to read these. She looked at George. "Oh, George, I don't see why you mind your dad borrowing Kirrin Island for a bit. I wouldn't mind my dad borrowing an island from me if I was lucky enough to have one. Your dad would talk to you about it first and ask your permission and see if you minded," said George sulkily. "My dad never does anything like that. He just does exactly as he likes without asking anybody anything. I do think he could have written to me himself. He just puts my back up." "You've got a back that's very easily put up," George said, and laughing. "Don't scowl at me like that. I'm not borrowing your island without your gracious permission." But George wouldn't smile back. She took her letter and read it again gloomily. "To think that all my lovely holiday plans are spoiled," she said. "You know how amazing Kirrin Island is in spring, all primroses and gorse and baby rabbits. And you and Julian and Dick were coming to stay, and we haven't stayed together since last summer when we went caravanning." "I know. It is a shame," said Anne. "It would have been brilliant to go and stay on the island these holidays. But perhaps your dad wouldn't mind if we did? We needn't disturb him." "As if living on Kirin Island with Dad there would be the same as living there all by ourselves," said George scornfully. "You know it'd be horrible." "Well, yes, and didn't think that Kirin Island would be much fun with Uncle Quentin there." George's dad was such a hot-tempered, impatient man, and when he was in the middle of one of his experiments he was completely unbearable. The slightest noise upset him. Oh dear, how he'll yell at the jackdaws to keep quiet, and shout at the noisy gulls, said Anne, beginning to giggle. He won't find Kirin as peaceful as he imagines. George gave a watery sort of smile. She folded up the letter and turned away. I think it's mean, she said. I wouldn't have felt so bad if only Dad had asked my permission. He'd never do that, said Anne. It just wouldn't occur to him. George, don't spend the rest of the day sulking. Go down to the kennels and fetch Timmy. He'll soon cheer you up. Timothy was George's dog, whom she loved with all her heart. He was a big scruffy brown mongrel dog, with a ridiculously long tail and a wide mouth that really seemed to smile. All the 4 cousins loved him. He was so friendly and loving, so lively and funny, and he'd shared so very many adventures with them all. The 5 of them had had many happy times together. George went to get Timmy. Her school allowed the children to keep their own pets. If it hadn't allowed this, George wouldn't have gone to boarding school. She couldn't bear to be parted from Timmy for even a day. Timmy began to bark excitedly as soon as she came near. George lost her sulky look and smiled. Dear Timmy, dear trustable Timmy, he was better than any person. He was always on her side. Always her friend whatever she did, and to Timmy there was no one in the world so wonderful as George. They were soon going through the fields together, and George talked to Timmy as she always did. She told him about her father borrowing Kirrin Island. Timmy agreed with every word she said. He listened as if he understood everything, and not even when a rabbit shot across his path did he leave his mistress's side. Timmy always knew when George was upset. He gave her hand a few little licks every now and again. By the time that George was back at school again, she felt much better. She took Timmy into school with her, smuggling him in at a side door. Dogs weren't allowed in the school building. But George, like her father, often did exactly as she liked. She hurried Timmy up to her dormitory. He scuttled under her bed quickly and lay down. His tail thumped the floor gently. He knew what this meant. George wanted the comfort of his nearness that night. He'd be able to jump on her bed when lights were out and snuggle into the crook of her knees. His green eyes gleamed with delight. Timmy on her bed. By an angry teacher's disappointment. The term ran with sunshine and nearer. And though now, lie quiet, said George, and went out of the sandy beach, its be cliffside walks. Room to join the other girls. She found N, who was Julian, and D busy writing a letter to her brothers, Julian and Dick, at term, both they equals their boarding school. I've told them about Kirin Island. And your dad wanting to borrow it, she said. Would you like to come and stay with us, George, these holidays, instead of us coming to Kirin? Then you won't feel cross all the time because your dad is on your island. No thanks, said George at once. I'm going home. They could meet together. The day, Cass Hall. Karzari lived fairly near the others. Do I want to keep an eye on Dad? I don't want him blowing noise of yellin' Kirrin Island with one of his experiments. You know, couldn't Mac up he's messing about with explosives now, don't you? Anyone atom bombs or something like that, said Gon Compellen. Oh, I don't know, said George. Anyway, apart from keeping an eye on Dad and my island, we ought to go and stay at Kirin to keep Mum company. She'll be all alone if Dad's on the island. I suppose he'll take food and everything there. Well, at least, we won't have to tiptoe around and, George. Miles in he time. Yes, you? Her he knows whisper, if your dad isn't at Kirin Cottage, said Down Ann. We can be as noisy as we like. Please cheer up, children. George. Whose tea but it took George a long time to get over the fit of gloom caused by her mother's letter. even having Timmy on her bed each night, till he was discovered by an angry teacher, didn't completely make disappointment. Up for her the term ran swiftly on to its end. April came in, with sunshine and showers. Holidays came nearer and nearer. And thought joyfully of Kirin, with its lovely sandy beach, its blue sea, its fishing boats and its lovely cliffside walks. Julian and Dick thought longingly of them too. This term both they and the girls broke up on the same day. They could meet in London and travel down to Kirin together. The day came at last. Suitcases were piled in the hall. Cars arrived to fetch some of the children who lived fairly near. The school coaches drew up to take the others down to the station. There was a deafening noise of yelling and shouting everywhere. The teachers couldn't make themselves heard in the din. Anyone would think that every single child had gone completely mad, said one of them to another. Oh, thank goodness, they're getting into the coaches. George, must you rush along the corridor at 60 miles an hour, with Timmy barking his head off all the time? Yes, I must, cried George. And where are you? Hurry up and get into the coach. I've got Timmy. He knows it's holidays now. Come on, Tim. Down to the station went the excited crowd of children. They piled into the train. Bagsy this seat. Who's taken my bag? Get out. Hetty, you know you can't bring your dog in here with mine. They fight like mad. Hooray, the guard's blowing his whistle. We're off. The engine pulled slowly out of the station, its long train of carriages behind it, filled to bursting with girls off for their holidays. Through the quiet countryside it went, through small towns and villages, and at last ran through the smoky outskirts of London. The boys' train is due in 2 minutes before ours, said Anne, leaning out of the window, as the train drew slowly into the London station. If it was on time, they might be on our platform to meet us. Oh look, George, look, there they are. George hung out of the window too. Hi, Julian, she yelled. Here we are. Hi, Dick, Julian.